Have you ever wondered what happens when the heart stops beating? Not what the doctors say, not what the Bible describes, not the faint light at the end of the tunnel like in the movies. I mean, really, visibly, deeply, what's waiting for us on the other side of the veil called life? I've lived long enough to stop believing in anything divine, but also empty enough to know that when everything else collapses, faith is often the only thing left standing. That night, I wasn't looking for death. I just wanted quiet. A night without voices in my head, without memories chasing me down, without shame dragging behind me like a shadow. I took the pills to sleep, just to sleep. But instead of waking up the next morning, I slipped out of my body like a door that opened halfway. No sound, no warning, just a gentle retreat, like the last breath leaving. And just like that, I was gone. My name is Victor Ellis. I'm 60 years old. I live alone. No pets. No phone calls. No one is checking in. I used to be a professor of philosophy. Used to believe I understood the meaning of life. I wrote books, gave lectures, and quoted Plato and Kierkegaard like some talking encyclopedia. I had a wife, a daughter, a home that looked like happiness from the outside. But I lost it all. Not because of war, not because of tragedy, but because I didn't know how to listen. I didn't know when to stop. I didn't know how to love when it mattered. And so I told myself, maybe silence is the most fitting punishment. Until I realized death isn't as silent as I thought. It speaks loudly. It speaks through light, through memories, through raw emotion that hides nothing. It made me face myself. And there was no turning away, no clever excuse to lean on. I was no longer Victor, the well-read scholar. I was just a bare soul standing in front of his own life. Are you still here? Because what I'm about to share isn't really about death. It's about the way I was given a chance to live again, but this time to live it right. What comes next will open the first door, where the darkness isn't as frightening as you think. It's where everything starts. Telling the truth. Are you ready? Some deaths happen while we're still breathing, and that's how I died long before that fateful night. No one noticed, no one wept, because people mourn the departed, not the walking shell left behind, not the rusted heart that no longer beats for anything real. I used to be a philosophy lecturer at a small college. No fame, no awards, but it was enough to have a row of students listening intently as I spoke about Sartre, about Camus, about being and absurdity. I talked a lot. I talked about purpose, about existential responsibility, about the freedom of choice. I lectured as if I understood it all, and yet I had no idea how to live inside the very things I preached. I married a woman who was gentle, deep, and endlessly patient. She wasn't a master of arguments, but she knew how to listen. She understood the things I never said. And the saddest part is, I didn't understand her. I thought love was about sharing knowledge, guiding through reason. All she ever wanted was to be reached through the heart. Slowly, she folded into herself, like a poem creased and tucked into the back of a drawer. Meanwhile, I kept chasing the meaning of life, through theories, never realizing that the true meaning had been sitting beside me every evening. Then she slipped into depression, quietly. No complaints, no blame, just silence. One time, I found her sitting under the shower for hours, eyes staring straight into the void, as if holding a conversation with a place I could never reach. I didn't know what to say, so I went to work, the easiest choice. By the time I came back, it was too late. The letter she left had only one line. I can't stay if I can't see myself in your eyes. I lost her, and I lost myself. My daughter was just 14 then. She used to be the little sun spinning around our home, while I was the moon buried in books. After her mother passed, she went quiet. I went quiet. Two silences living under one fractured roof. Eventually, she went off to college, then disappeared from my world. No calls, no messages. Maybe she believed I died long ago. Maybe she was right. I stopped teaching, stopped writing, stopped trying. Each day became a meaningless loop. Rereading old books, reheating stale coffee, and wondering if someone dies and comes back inside the same worn-out shell. Can that still be called living? There's something I've never told anyone. After my wife passed, I started hearing footsteps every night. Soft, careful, as if someone was still lingering in the apartment, not wanting to disturb. I used to think it was just my mind playing tricks, but strangely, it never felt frightening. Sometimes it brought me peace, as if someone were still here, watching, forgiving. One night, I dreamed of her. She was standing in the kitchen, back turned, washing a glass. Everything looked just like it used to be. I walked up, wanting to hold her, but when I touched her shoulder, she turned, and her face dissolved into light. I woke up with my pillow soaked in tears, and a heart aching like it had just wandered back to a place that used to be home. I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you because I need you to understand. Long before I left my body that night, I had already died. Died in regret, in loneliness, in unanswered questions. I had spent years teaching others about truth and never learned how to live honestly myself. I thought I understood everything until the cracks in my own heart became the only real teacher. And when death finally came, it didn't knock with thunder. It wasn't cold. It wasn't terrifying like I had imagined. It came like a messenger, gently tapping at my soul, whispering, "Now, are you ready to listen?" Next, I'll tell you about the moment I stepped out of my body and what I encountered beyond the darkness. It wasn't heaven. It wasn't hell. It was something no earthly language can fully describe. But I'll try, because I saw the truth, and you need to know it. That night began like any other. I turned on the soft amber light in the living room, poured myself a glass of aged wine, and played a Chopin sonata, the only music that still made me feel real. Then I sat down in my chair and stared out the window. The city was still alive. People were still loving, still arguing, still calling out each other's names from balconies across the way. And me? I simply sat in silence, listening to time slide across the glass. I wasn't planning to die. I didn't write a goodbye letter, didn't draft a farewell text, didn't take one last look back at my life. I just wanted to pause, like when you're tired from walking and you sit down by the roadside. That was all. One sleeping pill, then another, a small glass of wine, then just a little more. Not much, not reckless. I still believed I had control, like always. But this time was different. My chest began to tighten, as if invisible hands were pulling a string around it, winding it tighter with each breath. My heartbeat slowed, then sped up, then lost rhythm like a piano wire snapping mid-song. I tried to stand, but my legs gave out like wet clay. The room spun, the light smeared into long rivers of color floating in space. I collapsed before I could utter a word, and then the breathing stopped. No pain, no panic, just nothing. Absolute silence. And then darkness fell. Not the kind of darkness that comes when you turn off the light, but a dense, weighty blackness so thick it felt like it could press into you. It wasn't just empty, it was alive, and within it, I drifted. I don't know how long I floated. There was no time there, no ticking, no counting, no measuring, just me and the infinite. I had nobody, no arms, no legs, no heartbeat to listen for, but I knew I existed. Consciousness didn't vanish. It had separated from my flesh like a thin, weightless version of myself, drifting like a leaf just released from its branch. And in that stillness, I heard the first sound. Not a voice, not a word, but a vibration, like the resonant hum of the universe's deepest string, gentle and yet somehow all-encompassing. I didn't understand it, but I knew it was speaking to me. It needed no language. It spoke through presence, and I understood in a way I never had before. Then I began to move, fast, unbelievably fast, but without wind or shaking. There was no clear destination, yet a gentle pull guided me forward. In the distance ahead, I saw a dim glow, far away, like the first blush of dawn breaking on the farthest horizon. I knew it with absolute clarity that something was waiting for me on the other side of that light. Not heaven, not some divine figure, but an answer. I could feel it, not with my mind, but with my soul. As I drew closer to that glowing horizon, I saw what looked like a field, but it wasn't an ordinary field. Giant flowers grew in clusters, some towering several stories high. Their colors were vivid, so vivid it felt like life itself had been poured into them through raw emotion. And they communicated with me, not through words, but through feeling, through memory, through a strange connection that pierced so deeply I broke down in tears the moment I heard them. I had never felt love like that. I understood none of those flowers were judging me. Not a single one asked why I had given up. They simply knew me. They knew who I had been. They knew who I had hurt. They knew what I regretted. And somehow they said, "We've been waiting for you for a very long time." You might think I was hallucinating. I used to think the same when I heard stories like this. But when you go through it, when you find yourself on the other side, you realize the afterlife isn't anything like what you imagined. It's not like a prayer. It's not like a sermon. It's like coming home. In the next part, I'll tell you about my encounter with the being of light, the presence that shattered everything I thought I knew, revealing that all I had learned was just the outer edge of truth. And what I saw changed forever the way I see life. I thought I would keep drifting forever in that soft, glowing light, like someone lost inside a beautiful dream that never ends. But as I approached the center of the light, I felt something shift, not in space, but within myself. As if I were no longer the one moving forward, but rather the space itself was unfolding to receive me. A familiar feeling. Have you ever walked into a place you've never seen before, yet felt like you've been there all along? Not because of memory, but because your soul recognizes it. That's what it felt like when I encountered the light. It had no form, not an angel with wings, not an old man with a white beard. Just a radiant presence so pure that every shadow inside me revealed itself without needing to be peeled away. I didn't hear a voice, but I knew I was being asked something. Not with words, but with awareness. "Do you know where you are?" I didn't answer. I couldn't, because the question wasn't meant to be answered. It was meant to make me face myself. This wasn't heaven. And it wasn't judgment. This was the place where truth exists raw and unfiltered. No pretending, no hiding, no excuses. Every piece of my life unfolded before me like a slow-motion film. But it wasn't just images. I felt the emotions of those I had hurt, the pain, the disappointment, the loneliness. It all flowed into me. No one was punishing me. I was simply being shown myself through the eyes of others. I saw my wife, in those final days, sitting alone at the kitchen table, quietly twisting her wedding ring. No tears, no blame, just silence. I saw myself walk past her, briefcase in hand, asking mechanically, "You okay?" She nodded. I left. Back then, I thought I'd done my part. Now I understand that sometimes the question, "Are you okay?" without a heart behind it, is worse than silence. I saw my daughter, 16 years old, standing outside my study door, hesitating to knock, wanting to ask me something, then turning away. The second time, the third, and finally the last. I never knew that happened. Each memory was like an arm reaching out from within me, asking to be acknowledged, to be held. I couldn't run. I couldn't pretend to forget. I had only one choice left, to face it. The light did not condemn. It waited, like a father, not angry, but unwilling to let his child keep hiding. Why did you live without ever feeling alive? The question caught in my throat, because I didn't have an answer. Or rather, I did. I just never dared to admit it. I was afraid that opening my heart would lead to pain, afraid that love would be rejected, afraid that remembering what I had lost would make the wound bleed again. So I chose intellect. I chose knowledge. I chose to explain instead of to listen. I chose a life that was correct, but not true. The light didn't speak with words, but I understood. You are not being judged. You're being given a chance to understand. And when I finally understood, something unexpected happened. I was led to a place I have no name for. It wasn't a location. It felt more like a deeper layer of reality, the innermost chamber of my soul. And there I saw a river. But it wasn't made of water. It was made of memories, of emotions, of fragments of time swirling like waves. I knelt beside it, and the river spoke. These are the things you've never forgiven. I flinched. I thought I had been angry at my wife for leaving, angry at my daughter for going silent, angry at life for taking away what I loved. But no, I was angry at myself. I had never forgiven myself for not knowing how to love, for letting the one I loved most slowly sink into silence without ever noticing, for living without being awake. And then I saw a hand reaching out from the light, not to grab me, just open, an invitation. Do you want to go back? I broke down. In my entire life, I had never cried in front of anyone, never allowed myself to collapse. But here I bowed my head and dissolved, like salt melting into water, small, exposed, and yet, for the first time, fully myself. I didn't know what awaited me if I stepped into that light forever. Maybe peace, maybe the end. But I didn't choose it. I whispered, not with words, but with my soul. Give me one more chance to live, but this time, to live truthfully. In the next part, I'll tell you why I came back, how I woke up in the cold white stillness of an ICU room and began living a completely different life, where every action, every word, every glance held a meaning I had never seen before. Because this time, I was no longer the old Victor. When I asked to return, I thought it would happen instantly, that I'd wake up, open my eyes, and take a breath. But it didn't. Before life was allowed to enter my body again, the light offered me one last thing. Not a command, not a rule, but a question. Why do you think you're being allowed to go back? I stayed silent, not because I didn't know, but I was afraid of answering it truthfully, because the right answer hurt more than any physical wound I had ever endured. It was because I hadn't yet learned how to forgive. Not to forgive others, but to forgive myself. For all the nights I pretended to be busy so I wouldn't have to meet the sorrow in my wife's eyes. For the times I responded to my daughter with logic instead of love. For every opportunity I'd had to love, to embrace, to say I'm sorry, that I let slip away as if time would always be on my side. The light didn't judge me, but I felt myself shrinking, ashamed, like a child who's broken something precious and has no idea how to fix it. I wish I could go back and tell the woman I once loved that I finally understood. I wish I could call my daughter just to say, I may not have known how to show love, but I've thought of you every single day. I wished, but I knew wishes can't rewrite the past. And yet, the light seemed to say the opposite. The past can't be changed, but the present can redeem it. Suddenly, I found myself standing in a strange new space. It wasn't the river of memory anymore. It was a garden. And in that garden, shadowy figures began to appear. My wife, my daughter, students who once sat in my lectures, people I had wounded with my absence, my indifference. They didn't accuse me. They just looked at me with eyes that spoke, not of judgment, but of grace, of invitation. I walked forward, and with every step, memories returned. Words left unspoken, hugs were never given, silent glances that were never truly seen. And as I came closer, one by one, the figures faded, melting into the light, leaving behind an unfamiliar feeling inside my chest, relief. As if the scars I carried were being soothed, not erased, but acknowledged, seen. And because they were seen, they began to heal. I placed my hands together, not out of religious ritual, but like a child quietly asking for permission to begin again. And then I heard the final words from the light. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. Forgiveness is the act of those brave enough to keep going. And then I fell. Not downward, but back, like a leaf that has finished its flight, gently returning to the familiar earth. There was no pain, no panic, just return. I woke up in a white room, machines all around me. The heartbeat monitor was blinking like the first drumbeat after a long dream. A nurse shouted for the doctor. A man in a white coat rushed in, eyes wide with disbelief. But I just looked out the window. The sky was glowing. Sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting soft stripes across the wall. Gentle, like the light I had seen before. But this time, it was real, in this life. The first feeling I had wasn't fear. It was gratitude. Gratitude for still having a chance. Gratitude for being brought back, not to fix the past, but to live differently. Not to forget what happened, but to redeem it. I stayed in the hospital for 4 more days. No one came to visit, no family, no flowers, no familiar faces. But I didn't feel alone, because for the first time in years, I felt full from the inside out. When I returned to my apartment, I opened every curtain. I threw away the books that once made me feel intelligent but left me hollow. I found a piece of paper, and I wrote a letter to my daughter. No explanations, no long confessions, just, I want to see you. Not to say anything profound, just to hug you, the way a father should have done a long time ago. I didn't expect a reply. I didn't try to control the outcome. I just did what was right, because the light had taught me this. Healing doesn't come when others forgive us. It begins when we take the first step. In the next part, I'll tell you how my life began to change, how I started finding the broken pieces again, and why this return wasn't an ending, but the beginning of an entirely new life, a life that feels real. I used to think rebirth was something reserved for scripture or mystical stories, but no, I was reborn, right here, inside my same old body, with a heart beating to a different rhythm. The day I left the hospital, the doctor called it a miracle. "You shouldn't be alive," he said, half joking. I smiled. I didn't argue. He was right. I had died. Just not in a way anyone could see. I walked back to my apartment, each step like I was entering life for the very first time. Everything looked the same. The worn-out couch, the gray curtains, the dust-covered bookshelf, the photo of my wife on the table, her eyes gazing off into some distant place. But I was not the same. The world hadn't changed. I had. I no longer wanted to explain life. I wanted to taste it. I no longer wanted to read philosophy. I wanted to write my own, with flesh and tears and moments of quiet that said more than words ever could. On the first day of my return, I stood in front of the mirror for a long time, not to examine my reflection, but to ask, who is this man? I placed my hand over my heart. It beat, slowly, clearly, loud enough to remind me that I was still here. And if I were here, I had to live like it. The first thing I did was write a letter to my daughter, not to be forgiven, but because I needed to speak. I needed to be real. The letter was short, just a few lines. I used to think I was right, but the truth is, I was just afraid to love. I'm sorry. If you're willing, I'd like to start over, or start wherever you are. I stayed in the hospital for 4 more days. No one came to visit. No family, no flowers, no familiar faces. But I didn't feel alone, because for the first time in years, I felt full from the inside out. When I returned to my apartment, I opened every curtain. I threw away the books that once made me feel intelligent but left me hollow. I found a piece of paper, and I wrote a letter to my daughter. No explanations, no long confessions, just, I want to see you. Not to say anything profound, just to hug you, the way a father should have done a long time ago. I didn't expect a reply. I didn't try to control the outcome. I just did what was right, because the light had taught me this. Healing doesn't come when others forgive us. It begins when we take the first step. In the next part, I'll tell you how my life began to change, how I started finding the broken pieces again, and why this return wasn't an ending, but the beginning of an entirely new life, a life that feels real. I used to think rebirth was something reserved for scripture or mystical stories, but no, I was reborn, right here, inside my same old body, with a heart beating to a different rhythm. The day I left the hospital, the doctor called it a miracle. "You shouldn't be alive," he said, half joking. I smiled. I didn't argue. He was right. I had died, just not in a way anyone could see. I walked back to my apartment, each step like I was entering life for the very first time. Everything looked the same. The worn-out couch, the gray curtains, the dust-covered bookshelf, the photo of my wife on the table, her eyes gazing off into some distant place. But I was not the same. The world hadn't changed. I had. I no longer wanted to explain life. I wanted to taste it. I no longer wanted to read philosophy. I wanted to write my own, with flesh and tears and moments of quiet that said more than words ever could. On the first day of my return, I stood in front of the mirror for a long time, not to examine my reflection, but to ask, who is this man? I placed my hand over my heart. It beat, slowly, clearly, loud enough to remind me that I was still here. And if I were here, I had to live like it mattered. The first thing I did was write a letter to my daughter, not to be forgiven, but because I needed to speak. I needed to be real. The letter was short, just a few lines. I used to think I was right, but the truth is, I was just afraid to love. I'm sorry. If you're willing, I'd like to start over, or start wherever you are. I slipped it into an envelope, wrote the address I still knew by heart, added a stamp, and let go of any expectations. Forgiveness isn't waiting for someone to open the door. It's having the courage to knock, even knowing they might never answer. Then I walked to the neighborhood library and signed up to host a free talk called Stillness After the Storm. I didn't introduce myself as a professor. I didn't speak about philosophers. I just told my story. A man who thought he knew everything until he had to die to finally understand what it means to live. Each week, a few more people showed up. A woman fresh out of a divorce. An old man who had just lost his wife. A young man who had once tried to end his life. They didn't come for advice. They came to touch something real. And I spoke not with elegant words, but with the trembling truth of a soul that had broken open and somehow begun to heal. I started planting, on the balcony, along the windowsill, even in the little park near my apartment. Flowers, grass, vines. Each time I placed a seed in the soil, I imagined I was replanting something I had once lost. And then one day, when the first flower bloomed, I sat down beside it and whispered, "Thank you for waiting long enough to see me truly alive." In the next part, I'll tell you the most unexpected chapter of all. I finally saw my daughter again after all those years apart, something I never dared to dream, and how a single, quiet hug stitched back together the torn fabric of our long silence. Because some things, once spoken from the heart, will always find their way home. I didn't hear back right away. No message, no call. The letter I'd sent seemed to vanish into a long, quiet silence. But this time, I wasn't waiting. I didn't watch the clock. I didn't live in longing. I just kept planting little by little in the new soil of my heart. 3 months later, on a quiet Saturday morning, I was watering the balcony plants when the doorbell rang. Soft, hesitant. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I answered it without much thought. Standing there was a young woman in a white blouse, her hair neatly tied back, holding a small potted flower in her hands. Her eyes were red from tears, but they were bright. I knew her instantly, even after all those years. Even though she was no longer the little girl I once comforted with birthday cakes and bedtime stories. She stood there, looking at me for a long moment, then gently lifted the flower pot to her chest. "You used to say flowers can't speak," she said, "but I think if we love them enough, they do." I didn't say a word. I just opened my arms and held her, the daughter who once walked out of my life in silence, now returning with an embrace that said everything words never could. No explanations, no confessions. That hug lasted longer than time itself. It was forgiveness. It was memory, healed. It was everything I never believed I deserved to have again. We sat together in the small kitchen. No music, no philosophy, just two people, two hearts, and a story that had never been fully told. She asked me about the near-death experience. I told her, but I didn't dwell on the supernatural. I spoke about what was real, awakening. I told her I had died once just to learn how to live. I once thought silence was the end, but it turns out silence is where everything finally begins to be heard. That the light on the other side never asked what I had achieved or accomplished. It only asked, have you loved with your whole heart? And now I ask you, the one listening to this story, if today were your last day to live, how would you live it? Not rushing, not trying to be right, but being real, living without masks, living brave enough to say, I'm sorry, gentle enough to embrace your past, honest enough to let go of what no longer belongs to you, living as if every single moment were a seed you're planting into eternity. I don't know how many more days I'll be given, but I do know this. Every morning I wake up, I place my hand over my heart and say, thank you, I'm still here. And sometimes that alone is a miracle. My story ends here, but yours may be just beginning. Are you ready?